evening everyone to our session in the UK Pavilion on the pathway to climate resilient net zero food systems, and we'll be looking at how science and climate services can help support and secure global food supply. We know from the IPCC's recent report that climate change will potentially put millions more people at risk of nutrition insecurity by 2050, but also within the UK, the Climate Change Committee has recognised weather and climate extremes as one of the highest risk future shocks. So climate change is an issue for food security both in the global north and the global south. But as well as this, food systems emit about 35% of greenhouse gas emissions, so they have a really important part to play on the pathway to net zero. So I'd just like to introduce my panel who'll be joining me after two short talks. We have Keris Jones from the National Farmers Union, who's sitting there. John Furlow and Melody Braun from the International Research Institute for Climate and Society in the United States, and Chalizi Mazvandia from Fanapan in South Africa. Okay, so just like to introduce what we're planning to do today. We'll have two short talks and a panel discussion and question and answer session. So hopefully there'll be lots of opportunity for you to ask questions and get involved. Okay, so I'd like to talk to you myself about some work we've been doing in the UK around climate services for UK governments, supporting climate system resilient, food system resilience, but also on the pathway to net zero. Okay, so that really just to help you see the context for what we're doing for the work in the UK, it's work for our Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and a climate service on food farming and natural environment. Really, it's all about informing policy and action, and is set on a on a cornerstone really, or the foundation of climate projections. There's a cycle of climate projections we produce roughly every 5 years and update in the UK. They in turn inform a climate adaptation policy cycle which consists of various pieces of reporting, progress reporting and informing policy. And in particular, we inform something called the Climate Change Risk Assessment. Again, this process of drawing science together, a bit like a mini IPCC process, and in using that to inform a government climate change risk assessment, which in turn informs our national adaptation plan. So that's another cyclical process we inform. And also now every 3 years, Defra, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, produce a report on UK food security and the state of food security at a point in time. So really in terms of how climate change might affect UK food systems, this infographic's taken from the third climate change risk assessment, which was produced recently and looks at the UK agri-food system. I'd like to highlight a few things from this really. One is that it's not just about risks. Although it's a risk assessment, there are opportunities too in the changing climate, and there are benefits of taking further action. The other is, I think that's a really neat thing, is the way the climate change risk assessment classifies those risks and opportunities into the red colours you see on the map there, where more actions needed now, where we need to be doing more in terms of adapting to climate change and being prepared. The orange colours where we need more scientific evidence and underpinning information to support decision making. I'll stop there and just say actually there's quite a lot of that in terms of the risks that affect the UK agri-food system. So actually we also recognise agri-food as a high-risk area where we need to be doing more and understanding more. But also there are those green colours which are where it's more of a longer-term horizon scanning risk or opportunity. For example, looking at the long-term opportunities for food imports and breadbasket failures and so on. Finally, on this slide, just really to highlight, as the text shows down here really, there's quite a broad range of risks all across things like risk to soils, to productivity, but also those opportunities to grow new crops, to use new crop varieties, new cropping systems, impacts of sea level rise on saltwater intrusion, but also the risks to food safety and security both at home and overseas, because we do import about half the food that we eat in the UK. I'd also like to just highlight some of the opportunities for using weather and climate information to support resilient food systems. This work's taken from an academic partnership activity within the UK, and really just highlights that all the way from the top right left-hand corner there, which is using short-term local scale information to support tactical production decisions, things like weather forecasts, all the way out to the bottom right-hand corner, where we're thinking about using long-term climate projections to underpin risk assessments of major breadbasket failures or changing food import patterns. There are opportunities right across the time and space scales, basically. And in the middle as well, using longer-term seasonal to decadal information to support both things like longer-term land management decisions, but also to underpin information to support understanding on the kind of crops we need to breed to be resilient into the future, as well as thinking about planning and logistics. Just to give you one example, a more concrete example of the kind of work we've done taking climate information through to support food system resilience. This is taken from Freya Gary's paper last year, looking at compound risks, where we're not just thinking about one climate hazard, but where multiple things impact the food chain. In this case, high temperature and high humidity events, which can impact both the overall thermal heat stress that cattle experience, but also the risks of potato blight, which is a serious and impactful disease on potatoes, both of which then ultimately impact productivity. And so again, this kind of information can be used to help inform adaptation plans, the traits that we might want to see in crop breeding and varieties, and also how we house, manage, and the kind of livestock characteristics that we need for the future. And the map on the left-hand side just gives a sense of some of the percentage changes in red to cattle heat stress, and on the right-hand side, the brown colours are showing the change in potato blight risk for the 2060s. Really just to highlight briefly too, we also need not to just think about the production systems, which are a foundational part of food systems, but also about how changing weather and climate risks, and particularly extreme events, might propagate throughout the food chain, all the way from production, from farm to fork to the consumer end. And as this infographic, also taken from the academic partnership work, tries to highlight, you can see some extreme events can have impacts right throughout the food chain, not just on things like heat waves and drought impacting crop production, but also how we might need to transport food differently in order to keep it fresh and avoid spoilage, and changing consumer patterns in different weather regimes. So finally, really just to think about net zero and agri-food. Today we're thinking, as I said earlier, about the balance between adapting and resilience in food systems and the need to work towards climate mitigation targets. On the right-hand side is a pie chart from the Committee on Climate Change's work for the UK, just highlighting what some of the opportunities within the land sector might be to contribute towards net zero by 2050. So there are lots of options there, but I think some underpinning themes that emerge from the Climate Change Committee's work and beyond are the need to take systems approaches to think not just about net zero goals, but the other functions of land, multifunctional land use. Also the need for quite rapid and deep transformation of the food system and action that happens now, but also for quite significant areas of land to be released to help store carbon by the middle of the century. And recent work by the Global Food Security Programme has also been looking at scenarios for Paris compliance or low carbon and healthy food systems, and some commonalities across all of the scenarios they developed were higher food prices, the win-win of eliminating food waste right across the food chain, and of less land-intensive diets. So just to conclude really, I think we need to be thinking about the whole food chain in planning for the future, both in terms of net zero and in adaptation, and thinking about holistic and systems approaches in doing so, and critically thinking about the interactions between net zero and adaptation, but also make sure that we have really effective dialogue and co-design with farmers and the wider food industry. Thank you. Yeah, that's not a bad idea. Is this the only screen that's showing? Or there's one down there, but everybody's clustered at this end. Yeah. Oh, watch my laptop. Who? Is that better? Yeah? You can't see now, but everybody else can. Okay. So I'll now just introduce Shalidzi Mazavandia from Fanapan in South Africa, who's going to talk to us about some work funded under the GRCF program.
Good evening, colleagues. As it was said, my name is Shalidzi Mazavandia. I know for some people that's a mouthful. However, in the office they know me as TM, so I'm fine with that. So, because the screen is behind me, oh, okay, see here. Okay, so in terms of my presentation today, then I'm here to share with you the initiative that we implemented starting from 2017 to this year in April. That was an initiative that took us 4 years to implement. So we were doing this initiative to make sure that we co-create with our partners in country to deliver on certain things that I'm going to unpack as I go forward. So the screen in front of me is not moving, so I will use my phone as a prompt. So to underscore in this slide is that this project is informed by global, regional, and national frameworks to make sure that we attend to country-specific needs and also making sure that the evidence that we generate is building into regional frameworks. So what we did is that we also then underpinned the design of our project to make sure that we deliver outcomes and impact to make sure that we deliver on the 2030 SDGs. What we developed this program to deliver on in terms of contributing to knowledge was to make sure that we come up with pathways in terms of how then do we deal with the complex challenge of dealing with malnutrition and also then attending to climate issues. So these challenges are complex and they're interconnected. So while we're solving one, we thought that we cannot then ignore the other one. The other thing that we focused on in terms of the tools objectives, one, we wanted to make sure that we inform policy processes, both at a national level and regional level. The second thing that we wanted to do was to make sure that we build capacity of both individuals and institutions in country to deliver on climate-related challenges and nutrition-related challenges. So in terms of this project, because it was more of a proof of concept, we implemented this in Tanzania, in South Africa, in Zambia, and in Malawi. This slide is just to show you that the team that was implementing this initiative was multidisciplinary in nature. And the institutions that are presented here, they ranges from academia, from research, civil society organizations, and also to make sure that we bring in the private sector to make sure that innovations that we propose, they are taken to scale. So if you look across the countries, there's a bit of variation in terms of the type of institutions that were involved in the country, but the nature of the partnerships were multi-stakeholder in nature, representing different expertise. The approach that we used was three-pronged in nature. The first one was to make sure that there's integration of interdisciplinarity to make sure that we are building evidence from the ground, and also making sure that we involve those that are responsible for policies. Two important things here: bottom-up approach, and also to make sure that we are informing policy processes. Then the second approach then was to make sure that the research that we're implementing is generating future scenarios. We know that decisions that we take today, they will have got impact in terms of what will happen in the future. The third thing that we did, which the video will indicate, is that we have developed a framework, which then included data from biophysical, data from social science, data from economics, and also then being informed by expertise from the policy side. The next slide then is about now to indicate, based on the three approaches that we use, to show you that we have left something on the ground. What did we leave? Then, according to approach number one, then we convened scenario planning sessions where people coming from the Ministry of Planning, from government, were involved to make sure that the solutions that we're suggesting, they are based on the need of a specific country where we're implementing. The second one deals with the issue of the nature of research that we delivered. We are underscoring the fact that the teams were multidisciplinary in nature. And the third one is the IFID framework, which I will ask our colleagues there to flag the video.
We are already experiencing the impacts of climate change in the Southern Africa region. We are seeing more occurrences of droughts and floods. We are also seeing more occurrences of pests and diseases resulting from climate change. This has resulted in shortages of food, but at the same time, the region is grappling with the challenge of malnutrition.
There's uncertainty about what the future might look like. So what we hope is that IFID will be able to support the decision making so that we don't end up making decisions now that make the future really hard.
IFID stands for the Integrated Future Estimator for Emissions and Diets. It's evidence-based, designed to build sustainable policy pathways in sub-Saharan Africa.
It includes people from climate science, people from food science. We've got scientists from meteorology. We've also got people from agriculture, from economics. It's a mixture of different expertise coming together to find a common solution.
It involves the understanding developed not only from the models and data, but also by interactions with experts and local stakeholders in the AFRICAP countries that we work in.
Participatory scenario workshops were a series of workshops that we had right at the start of the project, where we brought in experts and stakeholders and said, what matters to you when you're thinking about the future of agriculture in your country? What's important?
IFID is hopefully going to be a useful tool to policymakers throughout the food system, particularly in the 4 focal countries of AFRICAP. I think its real utility is taking a holistic view and thinking about how all of the different elements of the food system come together, particularly given the huge uncertainties over what food systems might look like by 2050, mid-century.
My personal dream, if I can put it that way, is for this tool to be replicated beyond the pilot countries that at the moment are just Malawi, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zambia.
We want to call upon policymakers, we want to call upon governments, we want to call upon farmer organizations, civil society organizations, and all other relevant stakeholders to use the information, to use the evidence that has been generated by the IFID project to inform their programs, to inform their policymaking processes, so that we can be able to provide sustainable livelihoods for our people in our respective countries, as well as in our region at large.
Of time. So the 2 slides that I'm going to present now are dealing with the 2 major things that the project was focusing on. The first one was to make sure that we are informing policy processes. So what did we do to make sure that we are relevant? So what we did is that we were then meant to make sure that we inform policy processes, but the project itself didn't just go and suggest the policy that we are going to focus on. What we did was that we did consultations in terms of the already existing initiatives that the government were implementing. I will start with South Africa. With South Africa, then the main issue is about land reform and inclusion. So what we did is that we supported in terms of the agriculture and agro-processing plan that they were developing. What is it that we can do to make sure that is climate proof? So we're providing evidence to make sure that the way the plan was developed then is talking to climate change issues. So for Tanzania, it was different. They were implementing a community of practice in terms of innovation platforms where farmers and stakeholders then are convening to learn about and share experiences. So we supported that initiative. For Malawi, then there are various value chains that we supported. It means that then we didn't go and fly in to make sure that it means that we went there to make sure that we are building on the value chains that the strategies were trying to support. Then in Zambia, it was the same thing. Then the last slide is about the capacity that we try to build. Then there is a capacity that related to the institutions. We applied a framework that is called Partner Institutional Viability Assessment, which deals with issues that relates to governance, HR, the finance, programming, and how they deal with relations. So what we did there was to make sure that we are supporting the institutions to make sure that when they are implementing the project, then we are also attending to the capacity gaps that the institutions are having. The individual capacity emanated from when we had got fellows that went to Chatham House for them to be trained on how to engage with the policy the processes. The last one is about the Tanzania initiative, which I've already spoken about. So these are the partners that we have worked with. They are partners from Global North, and then there are partners that are residing in the Global South. What I appreciate about the project is that there was a mutual respect in terms of how we are managing the partnership. More often, when we are relating with partners from North, then the agenda is set from the institutions that are residing in the Global North. But in this partnership, then the evidence was built bottom up, and also in terms of making sure that the solutions are co-created, then those were jointly co-created then within the continent. This is the presentation that I thought that is worth for us to share with you today. Thank you.
Right, Pete and Chalitsi, would you like to take a chair with a microphone? Not everybody just yet, John. It's great to have such keen people. So, we've got time for 1 or 2 questions. If anybody would like to ask one. Anyone going to be brave enough to ask the first question?
Sorry.
Yeah.
I do have a question for Pete. You mentioned changing consumer patterns based on weather patterns. I was just wondering if you could go into a bit more detail on what exactly those changes are for consumers.
Yeah, it's more thinking about weather rather than climate change, actually. But what we know from work with retail partners, for example, is that typically in the UK, at least, when you get cold weather, people want soup and more hearty and more nourishing and warm food. If you get hot weather, then there tends to be a shift towards what we call barbecue food in the UK, but strawberries, lettuce, lots of fresh food. The challenge there that I see with climate change is that some of those things, particularly the vegetable crops, are very water intensive as well. So if you get hot, dry events and people want lots of food that is produced within the UK or indeed elsewhere, then there are challenges. And certainly with fruits and vegetables, actually a big issue for the UK is we import, I don't know, something like 70% of our fruit and vegetables from overseas, but not just overseas, actually regions that are vulnerable to climate hazards and water hazards already. So is that helpful? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'm not used to using this microphone. Yes, thank you. I do actually have another question, unless...
Yeah, I had a question as well. Thank you so much for the two presentations. It was really insightful. I was wondering if you could reflect a bit on some of the sort of developing technologies we can see in the food space, especially sort of smart agri solutions, and whether or not you think there are some specific infrastructures that we should be focusing on or efforts on, or if actually that's not the way to go. Sorry, quite a broad question, but thank you.
Yeah, I guess in a broad sense, yeah, it is a bit difficult to answer, but I think in a very general way, I think essentially the slide I showed with sort of the time and space scales is really about trying to make better use of weather and climate information throughout time scales and in as many opportunities where it can help food system resilience as possible and where it adds value. And so actually, I guess what a lot of that tech's about is being more intelligent about where we put things like fertilizers or water, and informing how and when we do those things, some of which needs to respond to the weather. So if you're, drawing down information on the weather as well as information on the land in helping make those decisions, then I guess that's in a very general way. I'm not sure I have something specific on the details of the technology. I don't know, Keris, whether you have a...
I might wait till the panel session, make the most of the two of you while we've got you. One last question. I have a question actually for Chalitzi and perhaps for you, Pete. You both talked about a little bit about using modelling and scenarios, and it seems to me either modelling or building scenarios for climate is difficult enough, and the same is true of agriculture, and then bringing them together. I was just wondering what challenges that has brought to your respective pieces of work.
In terms of how we approach this, I will then use the opportunity side rather than the challenges. What we did was that we used the co-creation approach, making sure that we include people from the planning department to make sure that they inform what is it that they are doing, in making sure that when we are trying to combine the biophysical, the socioeconomics, and also then to bring the policy side, what is it that they feel that need to inform the scenarios? Because the pathways that the government might choose to take has got risk and opportunities. What is it that they need to do to make sure that the path that they embark on gonna deliver positive results? So co-creation, I think, helps in terms of making sure that the data, which is more from biophysical, then is being informed by the realities that are on the ground.
Yeah.
I can't add very much to that. I think it's a really robust reply, but I think most of the work we do in the UK is focused more on policy and government, and I think in the same context, scenarios that we develop need to be co-designed with the policy makers and the policy teams, but the same applies at the other end of the scale with farmers and users.
Thanks both. That's great. Now just a quick move around of personnel.
Okay, so hopefully just to reintroduce our panel today, you've met Chalitzi already, and just we've got John Furlow at the International Research Institute in Colombia, and also Melody Braun sitting next to him. So welcome both. Hoping to have a panel discussion today really to look a bit further into climate resilient food systems and contributing towards net zero. And really, I have a couple of themes that we'd like to focus on. I think. Great. So the first one really is around the barriers, key barriers and opportunities in making sure that we do have resilient food systems that also contribute towards and meet net zero goals in the global north and global south. Melody, can I come to you first? Your views, please.
Sure. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, so I can talk about the experience that we have at the IRI, so it's the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. We have a group of climate scientists that work with meteorological departments around the world to produce climate information. And then we have people who work more on the translation of that information into different sectors and into actionable information that people can use in sectors that are impacted by climate. And so one of the biggest challenge that we observe is that there's really a gap between the people that are producing information, usually scientists, and then the people that are actually facing climate impacts and that are on the front lines and that are working in sectors that are affected, who are usually not scientists and who are usually not aware of the amount of information that exists, who are not necessarily connected with the meteorological departments, who, even if they are, don't necessarily know how to access the information or what to do with it. So there's really a lot of information. You know, we always hear that there's no data, and in reality what we observe is that there is a lot of data, but it remains underutilized in adaptation because those two groups of people are not always able, they don't always have opportunities to exchange, and they're not always able to communicate or to speak the same language. So there's really a need, in terms of opportunities, there's really a need to convene stakeholders from the data and the climate information side, who are usually scientists, and then from the decision-making side, that are usually practitioners working in sectors that are impacted by climate. And so, yeah, there's a need to reconvene those communities, and usually that takes intermediaries that are able to speak both languages. And we do a lot of that at the IRI. We focus a lot on participatory processes where we bring people in the same room to talk about the kind of impacts that people are facing, the kind of decisions that they're making, how the decisions are impacted by climate, and then what they can do differently if they had access to the right information, and then what information is out there, which can then be developed into tailored to specific examples.
Sounds like a good, thank you very much. Sounds like a really good point to ask Keris the same question.
I was thinking that myself. My name's Keris. I work with a farmers' organisation in the United Kingdom, and we are one of those communities that need the information that you have access to. And I do think that is an opportunity, because you're pushing against an open door. Weather and climate affects everything that farmers do, both directly and indirectly. And they need that information on many different timescales, both weather and climate, because of the range of decisions that they make. And farmers are already seeing change on the ground, again in both weather and climate patterns. So the opportunity is that farmers recognize that weather and climate are important to their decision making. The other opportunity is that they know what they want, and I think that's pretty rare when people are designing a climate service or a decision support tool. They want information on different parameters that are important to their business at different time scales. The final opportunity is that Pete, you talked about this, is that it can enable better decision making, improving resource use efficiency on farm, building resilience, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, building more sustainable businesses, and reducing the impact on the environment. But there are some barriers, and this probably won't be a surprise to anybody. It's around confidence and trust in the information that's being provided. How reliable is that information? And then farmers inevitably having to deal with uncertainty, because no system is perfect, but biology can't wait. And so my favorite line I ever heard a farmer spoke about, he says, when it comes to the weather, I try and make the least worst decision, which is probably a good point to stop and hand to somebody else.
Thank you very much. That's really useful insights. It's also made me think, I was reading the paper on iFeed on the plane on the way over, actually, again, Stuart Jennings' paper, which is very good if you haven't looked at it. But it did make me realise that when you were talking, Shalizi, about the uncertainty in the climate and the scenarios, the huge amount of uncertainty that is being drawn through climate and other factors in something like iFeed to then hit farmers on the ground. And I just wondered if you could explain a bit more your thoughts around how iFeed's helped to do that.
The point of departure is that for Africa, focus has been more on adaptation than mitigation. Yeah. So the approach that we took was that how then do we leverage the core benefit of adaptation and mitigation? And the lens that we used was that when we are talking about bringing in all these data sets that emanate from biophysical, socioeconomics, and also then from input from the policy side, what is it that we can make sure that we can have pathways that governments can use to make decisions? Because what governments normally do is that they will have policies which are statements of intent. So what iFeed did was that the outputs from the modeling, they were summarized in a way in which they are usable. And two, they are very much accessible. What we did also was to make sure that we go into portfolio committees, talk to both the policy makers and the researchers that also then feed into those people who are given the custody of making the policies, to make sure that the evidence then is reaching them. One thing that I also need to emphasize is that the challenge is that this type of work is implemented more in a form of a pilot. How then do we take this piece of work into scale? There are various ways in which we can do that. We can scale deep to make sure that the areas where we implemented, those lessons are implemented. There are other ways in which we can do in terms of scaling out and scaling up in terms of making sure that our evidence is forming policies, and scaling out to make sure that the geographies which didn't benefit from this investment are also then learning from this piece of work, which was more of a proof of concept.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I'd actually like to come back to you again, Keris, on this. We were talking about this and climate services and pieces of work being developed earlier in isolation and then sort of ending because it's a demonstration or a piece of research. I mean, how do we, what can we do to make sure these things have more resonance? What do we need to do to make sure they can be sustained for farmers into the future?
I don't think I have any answers for you, but I think it's a thorny question, isn't it? Because it was a great project. Farmers saw a need for it. Would wanted the tool developed further, but there's this gap from research to implementation, and this is an implementation COP. So, perhaps someone in the audience would have a great idea on how we make better use of all this great research and give it a much longer life and utility after the end of a project.
Thank you. Okay, I think we'll move on now to the second question, second focus really, which is around building on that, how countries and organisations can work together on the pathway to net zero climate resilient food systems. I'll come to you, John, first, if I may.
That's not the question I was expecting, but I'll try to answer. So the IRI, where Melody and I work, is we work exclusively in the developing world. And I think most agricultural systems, at least smallholder agriculture, has been on a path to net zero. It's not a major source of emissions. And personally, I think it's kind of unfair to put pressure on smallholder farmers in developing countries to solve this problem for the global north. So I'm going to do like a politician and answer a different question, if I may.
Yeah.
And so to the question that you posed to Keris, one of the ways that we try to work is to make sure that things get taken up and are sustainable, new practices, is to work within the systems that are already in place. So if agricultural extension is working, then we try to help the agricultural extension system take in new information at a time scale. So seasonal, weather, whatever is most important that's disrupting the farmers, but feed it into the system that's already there and build on the systems that have been put in place that farmers and government and civil society already used to working with. I think there was another part of that first question on how can North and South collaborate.
Yeah.
And I found recently, and I'm sorry for not answering your net zero question, but in talking to farmers in the United States and some winemakers in Europe, when I've showed them the types of seasonal forecasts that we provide in collaboration with meteorological agencies and extension agents in Ethiopia, Rwanda, Senegal, a lot of them say, wow, we don't have that here. And so we're finding that, as Melody said, there's a ton of data, especially in the US and Europe, but finding the right data to answer the questions that you're trying to answer can be hugely challenging. And so we're starting to, we've been around for 25 years. We've never really worked in the United States, even though we sit there in New York. We're starting to explore how we could take some of the methods that we've developed in collaboration with developing country partners and apply them to farmers and other stakeholders in the US and Europe, and use the methods that we've used in the developing world to simplify the amount of data that you have to sort through and get the right data to answer the right questions to people. And I apologize for ducking your question.
Not at all. No, it's a very relevant point. And actually, the discussion Keris and I were having was about some work on a EU-funded project, exactly trying to apply seasonal forecasts to land managers in the UK. And we found just some of those things that actually, you know, it was something that was quite frontier work. It was something that wasn't done a lot for a number of reasons, though there are challenges that actually the skill of seasonal forecast systems all year round, and particularly during the growing season in the UK, is somewhat limited. And another challenge of having a short-run research project was that you had a number of years or seasons to try this out and then stop. But actually farmers needed 5 or 10 years to actually trust those tools. Keris, you...
No? Oh, yes, now. I felt that process actually was very useful for both us and you. I remember those conversations you had the prototype and you were asking farmers to test it, and they wanted a slightly different format from which you'd presented. It kind of made more sense to their to what they were looking for, and also the way they wanted the information delivered. So I'm guessing there are many farmers across the world want everything on their mobile phone. So a mobile app rather than something they'd have to go back to the house and check on. But I felt that that conversation was as useful for you as for farmers.
Yeah, sure. Melody, if I come to you also on the similar question on global North and South collaboration, and this general anything you'd like to add?
Sure. So we work a lot. Oh, yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. So we work mostly in the developing world, and we always, one of the things that we notice when it comes to climate information is that there's often a tendency to trust information coming from the global north more than information in a specific country. So we have a lot of partners who NGO partners or public civil society partners who, when they need information, they're looking for information from, you know, the US, Canada, Europe, etc. But they're not necessarily aware of the kind of information that exists in their country. So we're really trying to work a lot on supporting the development of networks and trusted relationship within the countries where we work. Because obviously the goal for us is to, we work through projects, but the goal for us is that at the end of the project, we leave and the activities are sustainable. So I think in terms of global north, global south collaboration, it's really about how do we support the development of these sustainable, trusted networks within the countries where we work that include the local meteorological departments where we strengthen capacity, and that include people in different sectors in the country that are able to go to their local Met department understand the data that's there, understand how to apply it to their own sectors, and then basically run with it without needing external support. So that's the goal. It's not easy, but that's the goal. I think that's the goal in terms of Global North, Global South partnership on our side.
Thank you. Karis.
I was just going to comment on that issue of trust, because, again, this is just the UK. Our farmers would typically have about 2 or 3 weather apps on their phone and check them all, because they feel some are better for some parameters than others. Yes, it's kind of interesting how people rely on different sources of information, even with an amazing National Meteorological Office.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, though, actually. I was fascinated because we also work with some of the University of Leeds team in the project we collaborated on, and actually the learning about that, as you say, I think actually some of them used up to 5 or maybe more different weather apps. It was really, really quite shocking, and kind of created their own ensemble and their own suite of uncertainty, if you like. The other thing that was really interesting is how they interpreted weather forecasts in their local context as well, and they would know, if a band of rain is forecast to come in a particular location, actually that might miss me because of the lie of the land. It was really, really very interesting work. I think, some of the other theme I think really that interested me in what Chiliti was saying earlier around global North-South collaboration was the way in which your partnerships built and work. I wondered if you could just explain some of what you found really positive about the way the AFRICAP project worked together there.
The main issue which is at the center of your question is that who is in charge of the research agenda? Because the research agenda need to be context specific. When projects are designed, they are designed maybe responding to a call. And the call will prescribe where are you supposed to implement that project. Yeah. It means that as a delivery institution, we need to just go and superimpose what we propose as part of a project design to communities without understanding what are the real needs of those communities. So the question is, whose research agenda are we supposed to be pursuing? For me, is that the person who is at the center to benefit from the research work is the farmer. And now we are getting to ask the question, what should be the balance between research and development? Because when you go to communities, communities will be asking, what is it that you're going to leave us with? It means that we must have services that the farmers are benefiting in terms of making sure that when we leave that space after the start and the end point of a project, because a project has got a lifespan. When we leave that community, what is it that we are living within that community? Communities are now saying that we are very much over-researched. What is it that we need to bring as mechanisms to make sure that there's a feedback loop to make sure that the farmers are benefiting from the results that we're generating from the piece of research that we're implementing? The other one that I need to bring on board in terms of the global north, global south relationship is that there are capacity gaps from global south. How then do we make sure that this partnership are mutual beneficial between global south institutions and global north institutions? So we need to make sure that when we co-design these projects, then also then we take cognizance of what is it that this institution can deliver on and can deliver on. So these are the certain things that we need to navigate to make sure that when we're implementing, we are attending to on-the-ground issues, also institutional issues in terms of is there capacity then to deliver on this investment.
Thank you. I'm going to try and sum up now before I just give you an, well, actually, I'll sum up now and then give you an opportunity to ask any further questions. So I think we've heard a lot about how climate science and much broader science, actually, economic, social science and beyond, can be brought together to support net zero and climate resilient food systems in the global north and the global south. To me, there's a number of things that have really stuck out. The need to overcome barriers in confidence, in trust, reliability, uncertainty, inevitably across timescales to support decision making, the need for co-designed products and services that support and build up from the needs of users. Also, I think the need to build from opportunities of change that farmers are already seeing and feeling on the ground and help use that as a trigger, but hopefully be in a better position to respond rather than it always being the only trigger for change. I think also critically there's a theme around making sure that the lessons we learn are implemented and sustained, and the tools that we develop aren't just developed as part of a research project and that have a longer life. And in that sense as well, involving all of the actors, but particularly those on the ground in design of some of these research questions, the problem definition and the nature of the funding and the projects themselves, as well as working with the systems we have in place rather than always inventing new tools. So just like to finish there, but also leave an opportunity if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask of our panel now.
Okay, thank you. My name is Opre Chizuitano from Malawi. Happen to be one of the persons I have been working with CISADED on a number of policy projects. Through the experience, we have found out that most of the policies are just fine and good, but there is a gap between the issues of when it comes to engaging the little farmers on the ground. There is such a thing that some policies maybe are developed at the nation or international level. Most of the farmers in the local community are not aware of what is going on. I think most of the policy dissemination, they are not taking place fully, considering that we have some good policies that if we have to go and disseminate to those who do the actual work, it might be helpful in the development. So what I want to ask is, how can we strike the balance between farmers' demands and those stakeholders that are in control of those policies in order for farmers to actually benefit from those policies that are developed? Thank you.
Thank you. Can I come to each of you for a brief answer on this, if that's okay? How can we balance between the demands of the on-the-ground users and what the stakeholders need for policies and so on? John?
So I think that's an important point, and I think that governments and stakeholders should recognize that the policies may be written at the government level, but they're implemented at the smallholder, the individual actor, private actor level. So the policy should support, the policy should include support for key actors to be able to implement. And if that's not there, then the policy won't succeed. So if a new agricultural policy places expectations on smallholder farmers, but they aren't able to implement that policy at the field level, then there's something wrong with that policy. And along with any new policy, the smallholder farmers or whomever is being affected, it needs to be very clear why the policy is being written and implemented so that there is ground level support for it.
Yeah, I think it just shows that we still function in very siloed systems, and so in order to address these kind of issues, you need to have policymakers in the same room as the people who work with communities. Obviously, you can't put every community in a room with you can't have everybody in the room. But for example, we work a lot with agriculture extension officers who work with the farmers all around the country, or it could be, sometimes it's private sector, sometimes it's a public sector, but it's NGOs that work specifically with farmers. And those people should be in the room with policymakers to be able to exchange about what's going on at the policy level, what's going on the ground, and how can we communicate this, and how can we bridge that gap more efficiently. And I think we need more of these transdisciplinary dialogues through convening mechanisms that are not happening enough yet.
Thank you.
For me, I don't know whether I will still be popular after saying this.
African governments have policies as statement of intent, and they don't accompany that with proper investments. So I can imagine Africa where there is no donor funding, how it will look like, because governments are not investing to make sure that their policies are implemented. The role of government also is to create a conducive environment to make sure that private sector come and invest. So one, government is not investing enough. There is no conducive policy environment for private sector to come and invest. So government need then to make sure that they have got budgets that are allocated to make sure that their policies are implemented.
Thank you.
So I would say co-design, so that the people who are implementing have had an input to the policy as it develops. And here at COP, we have farmers and farmers organizations from across the world. And we think that farmers organizations, these are organizations built by farmers, so they're people that farmers trust. We think that these have untapped potential in supporting these partnerships and supporting co-creation of policy. Thanks.
I think that's an excellent note to end on. So thank you very much for joining us. Hope you've enjoyed the event today. And if you join me in a round of applause for our panelists, please. Thank you.